Welcome to the Body First Healing Podcast. I'm Britt Piper, survivor turned somatic experiencing practitioner and author. If you feel stuck in old patterns, overwhelmed by your emotions, or disconnected from yourself, you're in the right place. Each week, I'll share practical somatic tools, personal stories, and conversations to support you in building a more regulated and embodied life. Because you can't talk your way through healing, you have to feel your way through. Together, we'll explore what it means to come back to yourself and create a life that feels safe enough to fully live in. I am so glad that you're here. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to the Body First Healing Podcast. Today, we are going to be doing a solo episode question and answer. I received so many fantastic questions from you all over Instagram. And today I have selected, maybe the top 10 or so. We'll see how many we get through today. And whether you are looking for input and guidance in relationships, in somatic healing, in chronic issues or illness, this episode is going to be for you today. So let's jump right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. The first question I want to talk about. I have PTSD from domestic violence. I left 8 years ago. And now I'm ready to heal. I don't know where to start. Any advice? So first, I just want to say here that the word that really stood out to me when I was reading back this question is that word readiness. You stated here, I'm ready to heal. And that readiness matters. Knowing when you are ready for something, having that choice to move forward is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about an experience in healing from something like domestic violence, because it's such an experience of power and agency and autonomy being taken, choice being taken. And so being able to decide for yourself when you're ready is really, really important. So I just want to validate and honor that just from the jump. And so my question for you might be, how does your body show you that it's ready, that it finally feels safe enough to begin? And you can start with this process of healing by moving slow and starting small. Okay, healing PTSD, first of all, is not about reliving the past. It's not about rehashing your history. You don't have to go back to the hurt in order to heal. Instead, it's about restoring safety here in the present, here in the now. And you start that by helping your system, by helping your body feel in moment to moment. When you get that opportunity for choice, for agency, and for stability again in your life. So when you get to make the choice of whether or not you want to have, dessert or not have dessert, I know it sounds so simple. But how is your body showing you, I want to make the choice that I want dessert today after dinner, or I don't want dessert today after dinner, right? Lean into your body's cues and that somatic awareness of getting to choose and have your own autonomy, again, just in the small little things every single day, is going to help you to reclaim that power and that agency in your own life. You also want to focus too on starting to build your regulation within your system. When we're in experiences where it feels like we don't have power, where we feel like we're stuck in this toxic conflict, or we don't feel safe in our relationships, in our environments, then we can get stuck in survival mode. And so the first order of business is going to be to start to build up that sense of safety for your nervous system to really anchor onto. We want to show, not tell your nervous system that there is safety to now be experienced. And this can be done through simple practices like resourcing, orienting. So orienting is using your senses to just kind of take in the space and the environment around you. You can call it a sensory scavenger hunt. What are 5 things that you see that feel pleasant to notice? 4 things that you hear? 3 things that you can smell, 2 things that you can touch, 1 thing that you can taste. And again, it might not feel like in the moment it's doing much, but you are making physiological and cellular changes to the nervous system. And you're rewiring the nervous system for a place of presence, back to a place of safety and connection, rather than this toxic state of protection or disconnection. So those would be some of the first steps. And then, of course, if you want support in that journey, things like somatic therapy, like somatic experiencing, it's a beautiful place to begin because it meets you where your body is at without rushing the process. Again, it meets you with your readiness. Let's get into our second question. What is a way that we can check in with ourselves daily and nurture our nervous system? So I'm going to share with you, give you a little bit of a sneak peek into the work that we do in the Body First Healing Program, which is my 6-month trauma and somatic and nervous system healing container and program. So we do daily tracking, and tracking is our way of kind of checking in with the body and checking in with the system. How does my body feel today? How does my body want to feel today? Is there an emotion that it wants to feel? Is there a sensation that it wants to feel? Oftentimes we start off our day by being in our heads and with our to-do lists, right? I have to do A, B, C, D, X, Y, and Z, but maybe our body is actually sending us a different sign, a different signal, and we override or we don't listen and we stay on autopilot. And what can start to happen is that the further and further we get into disconnection from what our body really wants, the further we get away from our own authentic wants, desires, and our own true selves. So with the intention of reconnecting to our own authenticity, reconnecting to our own body, one of the things that we do is daily tracking. And so in the morning, you can wake up and you can ask the question, how does my body want to feel today? I would recommend going over to Google and typing in emotion wheel. The emotion wheel is going to give you a nice little illustration that a lot of therapists use and somatic practitioners use to really break down all of the different emotions that we experience day to day. And get curious about that emotion wheel. Every morning, is there an emotion that pops out to you, right? Because how often do we start to talk to our body? How do I want to feel today? And the body doesn't say anything back. That is likely going to be your experience as you start doing this kind of somatic practice, because that's maybe a language that you haven't learned or perfected or have become fluent in yet. It takes time, it takes repetition, it takes practice. So for now, you can have this cheat sheet, this emotion wheel. And when you find an emotion that sticks out to you, that feels intriguing, just go with the first thing that pops out on the page. Wow, today I want to feel peace. Today I want to feel excitement. Today I want to feel love. I want to feel gratitude. And then what you're going to do is you're going to set an intention, a small intention that will last maybe only 5 to 10 minutes. So today I want to feel connected. Today, I want to feel playful, and I will accomplish this by, so let's say it's playful. Today, I will accomplish this by playing fetch with my dog for 5 minutes, or coloring with my kids up in the playroom, or going to the playground, or watching, having a funny comedy podcast on in the background while I'm doing my office work today. And the great thing about that is that what you're doing is you're starting to not just listen and learn the language of your own body and your own system, but you're also starting to honor it, which is such a beautiful thing. And then I would say maybe a second tool that you can use, and I do mention this in my book, Body First Healing, is starting to have more of an interoceptive awareness. So interoception is the internal language of our body. And primarily, we notice our interoception through sensation. Right? Through what we are sensing internally in our viscera, in our organs, in our muscles, in our joints, in our respiratory system, in our cardiovascular system, right? Our circulation, our body temperature. All of these things are things that we can track to see how the body is feeling. And it's this internal state of how we're feeling that's going to affect how we show up in our external lives. But again, so many of us have not learned this language. And so our body, again, might be sending us signals throughout the day that it needs our attention, that it needs something, yet we haven't learned how to slow down to listen. And so building up interoceptive awareness is our way of, again, learning that language. So I invite you to start tracking a couple of things. First of all, What do you notice internally through interoception when your body sends you the signal that it needs to go to the restroom? What do you notice about your belly? What do you notice about your pelvic floor, right? What do you notice in those areas of the body? How do you know that you are thirsty? What do you notice in your throat, in your tongue, in your jaw, in your face? How do you know that you are hungry? How do you know that you're tired, right? What do you notice in your posture, in your muscles, in your breathing, in your circulation? How do you know that you're excited and you have a lot of energy? These are things that you can start to track. And the great thing is that as you start simple, what starts to become more obvious and what starts to emerge is the other language, the deeper languages that we maybe haven't been able to access, either because of experience where this language was overridden or because we learned to ignore it. And this is the language of our yes and our no. So how do we know when our body is telling us yes to something? How do we know when our body is telling us no? No, I'm not okay with that. No, I actually would not prefer that we do this one thing, right? It's important to learn the language of our yes and our no, but that comes with time. So starting off with just simple somatic awareness, leaning into your body's cues can be a wonderful place to start to rebridge that connection of the somatic language that you carry. All right, let's get into our next question. What's the best way to learn somatics myself since I'm already working with a trauma therapist? Yeah, I think that a great way to learn about somatics, which again, somatics is anything that is of the body, is going to be to actually lean into your own somatic understanding. So I know I'm kind of getting redundant here, but somatics is not something that we learn, okay? There's learning somatics, and then there's experiencing somatics. So if you're really wanting to learn more, of course, I can recommend a lot of fantastic books by Dr. Peter Levine, books by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, books by Dr. Stephen Porges. I would say Dr. Gabor Mate, he has some fantastic books on trauma and how it lives within the body as well. And of course, my book, Body First Healing, is a really great deep dive into the work. But when we talk about learning somatics, it's more so, how can I feel into my body more? How can I create a deeper capacity to experience my body more? Because the language of somatics is feeling, sensation, emotion, impulse, right? It's all this implicit experience that we have within the body. It's not necessarily a thought or a cognitive experience, it's a felt experience. And so one way to really sharpen this skill set and to build more of your somatic awareness is to get good at observing yourself. One way that you can think of this is separate witness consciousness, which is where you are separating yourself from your body and you're holding this awareness that my body is experiencing anxiety right now. So instead of identifying with I am anxious or I am angry or I am excited, it's my body's experiencing excitement. And then you can ask the question, and how does my body show me that excitement? How is my body experiencing that excitement? Well, I'm noticing that there's an increase in my heart rate. I'm noticing that I feel bubbly in my chest. I'm noticing that my eyes are lighting up and that I feel like I have this wider gaze. I'm noticing that it feels like there's energy moving through my limbs, right? This is somatic awareness, and that comes through embodiment and not so much education. Okay, I absolutely love this next question because it's something that I have been exploring a lot more myself. And the question is how to help with PMS hormones, luteal phase, period, migraines, all of the things. So my periods, since I have had children, and since I've been breastfeeding, have completely changed. My menstrual cycle has completely changed. I've noticed that I am more tired during my luteal phase. I've noticed that there were times where I was certainly PMSing more, and I was really just curious about this. I'm like, why am I so reactive during these times? I never used to be like that. And so it led me down to this deep exploration into my cycle. And what I learned is that the luteal phase is not a dysfunction, okay? It is a descent. It is when your nervous system is going into or shifting into more of a parasympathetic state. So you're going to feel more slow. You're going to feel a bit more lethargic. The energy goes inward, kind of like hibernation, right? There's conservation because there's so much happening within the body. I mean, the body is building up all of this lining only for it to shed. And so your body is doing a lot of internal work, which requires a lot of that internal energy, not external energy, not external output. And so I've seen this show up in my routines and not feeling like I'm as productive during my luteal phase. I've seen this show up in my workouts, not being able to lift as heavy, feeling tired. And I think that I've just had to accept that and recognize that, again, it's not a sign of dysfunction. It's just a sign of descent. But what can also be kind of triggering, I think, for some women, especially overachieving, hardworking, type A women, maybe you could say, is that when we're stuck in survival states, slowing down can feel unsafe. And that was probably it for me too. I talk very openly about how I've been overcoming this need to achieve. I was the recovering workaholic. And so giving myself permission to slow down is something that I have had to learn over the past 5 years after becoming a mother, after seasons of burnout. And so when we are chronically stuck in survival mode, slowing down can also feel unsafe, which can then just activate the nervous system more, which can then just increase some of those symptoms that we have. What can be important during this time is to not push through, but let your body yield. And you can do this, like quite literally, by resting, letting your body physically and somatically yield. You can yield into your chair, letting your back and your spine collapse. You can yield with blankets on top of you. You can yield into the earth, feeling your feet on the ground. These are ways that you can let the body just rest, and that is going to be so much more beneficial for your cycle. So don't resist this phase, lean into it. Now let's do a deep dive into PMSing. And again, I'm expanding a bit more on this topic because it's something I've personally been exploring myself. But PMS is kind of like this amplified survival energy. It's not just your hormones. Okay, you're going to experience PMS through mood swings, through irritability, maybe even rage. And it's often reflected as unprocessed fight or flight. So think of your PMS as like lifting the veil on the things that you have not been taking the time to process in your day-to-day life. Okay, this veil, it starts to thin, and what you're carrying or what you've been carrying and haven't been prioritizing and processing, it's going to show up even louder during this phase. When we are experiencing some of that fight or flight, right, some of that anger or that fear that we experience when we're PMSing, all of the blood motility in our body goes outward to our limbs to propel our limbs for fighting or fleeing. And so using the limbs as a way to move out some of that adrenaline and cortisol can help your cycle and can help some of those symptoms of PMSing. So some somatic exercises that you can use to support some of that discharge from the limbs are going to be things like stomping in place, pushing into a wall for 30 seconds, releasing, doing it again for 30 seconds, do 3 rounds of that. You can also do gentle, like primal sounds to release charge. Vocalizing is another way to release some of what's being held. So another question within this luteal phase period, migraines, PMS, is all about migraines. So migraines we see in the somatic world as typically a sign or an indicator that there's top-heavy overwhelm or activation. In other words, there's too much overwhelm in the head and there's no place to land. And this can usually be paired or linked with disconnection from the pelvis, hips, or belly. And listen, this makes sense because there's a lot going on internally during the luteal phase, preparing for shedding and our bleeding phase. And so if we've experienced, especially, as a sexual assault survivor myself, if you've experienced any kind of trauma where your boundaries were crossed, whether it was an assault, whether it was a medical intervention, whether it was a difficult birth, what can happen is that when there is pain or discomfort or activation in the belly, in the pelvic floor, in the hips, those parts of the body can start to dissociate. And so what happens is it's like, I can't feel this down here. So instead, the body pushes all of that pain upward, what we call activation upward. And so what I would encourage is support in the lower body. You can do this with hip rocking. You can do it with weighted blankets over the pelvis, heating pads, of course, hand on the head, which is where the cranial dome or the cranial diaphragm is, and then a hand on the hip can be helpful. Placing a hand on the head and the belly can be helpful. Okay, so self-touch can be really supportive. So one thing I just want to say, just kind of in closing on this topic, is that your cycle is really going to mirror your system's sense of safety, right? So what I have learned about myself over the past 5 years is I've been really, again, like peeling back these layers on burnout and overachieving and coming into a slower season of life, is that dysregulated cycles often reflect a nervous system that doesn't feel safe enough to soften, to slow down. And so we resist that. And so we can't force hormonal balance. Okay, but we can increase our safety cues as a way to support the body when things feel overwhelming, when it feels not safe. And so micro-resourcing, like the orienting that I mentioned, or the grounding practices, co-regulation, self-touch, these micro-resourcing moments, they matter, okay, and make a huge difference. Okay, let's move into our next question. How do you increase the size of your emotional container practically? So when we talk about our emotional container, we're talking about our capacity to somatically be with an emotion. I often will say it's not that the anger is too big, it's that your capacity to be with the anger is too small, and we call that your container. So how can I expand my capacity? How can I expand my container? You can do that in practical ways by gently and tolerably allowing a little bit of that activation to be experienced without shutting it down, without running away, without avoiding it. And so what I recommend that people do is doing that actually not in moments where you feel activated, but doing it proactively. And this is something that we practice a lot in the Body First Healing program. And that means that in moments where you feel neutral, right? You feel like you're maybe in ventral or rest and digest. You feel fine. You don't feel triggered. You don't feel activated. I invite you to take 2 to 3 minutes to do some kind of somatic exercise that allows you to be with a moment of discomfort. And the question that you can start with is, what's something in the past week that felt unpleasant? And what this means is it's going to open you up to lots of different experiences. There was a moment where I felt overwhelmed. There was a moment I felt anxious. There was a moment I felt angry. There was a moment I was really procrastinating. There was a moment that I felt judged or rejected. Whatever comes up for you, okay? And you're going to start with a mild moment of discomfort, unpleasant. And I want you to reflect back. What was happening? Who was there? What was I thinking? What was the situation at hand? Think about that for about 30 to 45 seconds. And then I want you to start to track internally. And what is my body now experiencing? What shifts are beginning to take place? Wow, I'm noticing that my palms are sweating. I'm noticing that my heart rate has increased or decreased. I've noticed there's a change in my posture. I want to run away. And here is the thing. Can you stay with yourself for just a little while in that moment? Because as you do, you're expanding your container. You're expanding your capacity to be with a moment that doesn't feel pleasant, right? And then what you're going to do is then you're going to come back into a moment of resource. Okay, so we call this pendulation. So let's say the resource is orienting to the room around you. Okay, so let's take ourselves back out of that memory, out of that moment, and can I notice the trees outside swaying? Can I notice the curtains over here and the shadow down on the carpet? Can I notice the sound of the air conditioning? Can I be with the smell of the incense in the room? Right, and what you do is then you just come back into presence. And what you just did is you just went to the nervous system gym. And we do the nervous system gym once a week, every week in the Body First Healing program. Every Monday, we do work like this. where we are going and we are getting in our reps. And this is how you start to build your container and expand your capacity to be with both discomfort and things that do feel comfortable. So for this next question, I first just want to thank you for sharing a little bit of your heart and your history. And I think the Cliff Notes version here is, I healed my trauma, which also meant the dissolution of my marriage after getting healthy. How can I heal from this, which brings me anger, guilt, and sometimes wishing I didn't actually end my marriage? So I think one of the experiences or the outcomes of somatic healing that people are maybe surprised by or maybe weren't prepared for is the clarity that healing starts to bring that perhaps they weren't ready for before, like realizing that certain relationships were built around survival patterns and not true safety. And this can begin to happen when we start to reconnect with the body again, when we start to reconnect with emotion, when we start to reconnect with our boundaries and what authentically feels good and not good. I think a lot of the problems that we're facing today and a lot of the symptoms that we're healing in the somatic space come from the result of being so disconnected and dissociated from our authentic selves, from our true desires, and just from life in general. And so when we start to reconnect with those things that feel authentically good or authentically not good, there's a bit of a grieving process that happens when we recognize that the version of us that once fit into this life is no longer the version that we are becoming. And it's normal to feel anger, to feel guilt, and to feel grief for those things. So it's important to remember that just because something no longer fits doesn't mean that it never mattered. Both can be true. Love existed and you outgrew the container. And this is where internal family systems or parts work, otherwise known as inner child work, which is a modality that we explore in the Body First Healing program, can be incredibly supportive. And that language would sound something like this. A part of me feels anger, feels guilt, or even grief for the way that things ended, while another part of me also feels so relieved, so sure that this was the right decision to make. So somatically, let yourself also feel the rupture, the ache, the loss, the ambivalence that comes with it, the relief. All of it belongs here. All of the parts belong. All right, so let's move on. Do you think that chronic fatigue syndrome can be investigated with polyvagal theory and somatic experiencing as a chronic shutdown state? Yes, I absolutely do. So I first just want to say that chronic fatigue syndrome is very real, right? And so I just want to validate that these are very complex experiences, especially from body to body, individual to individual, system to system. And so I feel like somatic experiencing or polyvagal work should be integrated very carefully, not as a replacement necessarily for medical care in all cases, but more as a complementary lens. Okay, and we get a lot of people, again, in the somatic world with these kinds of symptoms and challenges, but you can see it as more of a chronic state of shutdown. Okay, so the polyvagal lens is the nervous system lens, and in the polyvagal world, we think of it's kind of like a freeze response, but instead we call it your shutdown or your dorsal state. Okay, and so we can end up in chronic adaptive states of dorsal if we have one of three things. Either number one, we have a system with unprocessed activation. So maybe we grew up in an environment where the nervous system learned to adapt, to dissociate, to shut down, either because there was abuse or an unsafe environment or conflict or something happened and we went into more of a chronic state of shutdown. And so underneath that shutdown is this bound sympathetic energy under this collapse. And I saw Gabor Mate talking about this once, that your exhaustion is a mirror for how much activation and unprocessed emotion and charge that your nervous system is holding down. And think of it like a beach ball being held down under the water. how much energy it takes to suppress, to hold down, right? To bound and collapse all of these things that your nervous system wanted to do, but it couldn't do back then, like run away, like fight back, like advocate for yourself. So we can end up in chronic dorsal because one, we have a system with unprocessed activation. And so now we're bound in this collapsed state, kind of stuck. Or two, we have a system that doesn't have enough sufficient safety cues, okay, where the body never feels safe enough to come out of this immobility. It never feels safe enough to thaw out, to come out of its turtle shell. Or number three, we are stuck in this kind of chronic dorsal state because we have a highly sensitive neuroceptive system. It's like we have spidey senses that never turn off. And so when we get chronically stuck with this highly sensitive nervous system, the body can over-detect danger, and our reflex is going to be to immobilize, to collapse, to shut down, and dissociate. And so in our SE work, when we work with things like CFS, oftentimes we are aiming to resensitize the system to micro movements of mobilization. And that means, how can we gently be with a moment of fight or flight, right? If that's what's being held down within the system, how can we be with a gentle moment of, oh, I felt frustrated the other day when someone cut me off. Yeah, and I'm feeling that tension in my jaw. And can I allow this to just be here, right? We're not going straight into trauma or unprocessed activation. We're just working with moments in the present where we feel mildly activated, and we're allowing the body and the nervous system to process that. And again, this slowly starts to build our capacity and our container to be with more rather than reflexively or impulsively shutting down. And of course, we want to build up more of those safety cues, right? The second reason that we can get stuck in chronic dorsal, as I mentioned, was we might have a system with insufficient safety cues. So that means we really want to spend time resourcing as much as we can, really orienting, co-regulating, leaning into our sensory motor system, feeling presence. And those things are really going to help us to become more present in the body before we can then start to move up that polyvagal or nervous system ladder. So I truly love this next question because I feel like this is something I don't often talk about, and that is my speaking career. How did you get into speaking? So when I am not working as a somatic experiencing practitioner, when I'm not busy momming, wifing, podcasting, or writing books, I am actually a professional speaker on the topics of sexual violence prevention and response and recovery and trauma-informed practices. And I've actually been doing that since 2012. So I've opened up quite a bit about my experience of being sexually assaulted in 2009 at the age of 20. And following a nearly 2-year brutal trial process, my perpetrator was sentenced to 60 years behind bars. That trial took place in 2011. And during that 2-year period, I became incredibly close with the detective who worked my case. And I also became close with the sexual assault nurse examiner who worked my case. And they were 2 females. They were incredible. Following the trial, they actually reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in partnering with them to support them in teaching rape aggression defense courses at local colleges and universities in the area. And they had been doing that for years, but they believed that having a survivor's perspective or a voice added into the dialogue and the conversation would really, really help. And so I agreed and I said yes. So back in 2011, my first time speaking on a stage about my experience was done alongside both the detective and the sane nurse from my case, and the rest was kind of just history. Within a few years, I was speaking on my own. Then I joined a speaking agency back in 2015. I've been with that same agency since, and to this day, I've done over 600 programs spanning 3 continents, and I speak to kind of a diverse audience. I work quite a bit with the United States military, helping them with their sexual assault response trainings. I work a lot with the Department of Justice and violent crimes units. I do a lot of the trauma-informed and the forensic neurobiology trainings for those different entities and organizations. I work a lot on college campuses. I actually start back up next week, and I do a lot of sexual violence prevention programs there. And then I also speak in the wellness space. So whether I'm talking about trauma-informed practices, resilience, recovery, healing, somatic practices, these are all topics that I just love to educate and teach about. All right, moving into our next question. Severe anxiety, how to manage it while working with an SEP once a week. So I'm going to just be really honest here. If you are working with a somatic experiencing practitioner once a week, you are doing more than enough. I actually don't know that I would encourage you to do more. And I would say that it's less about managing your anxiety and trying to get to a place where you can start to meet your anxiety. We often think that we need to be doing more when it comes to nervous system regulation, somatic healing, and it's less about the technique. It's less about the practices and the regulation, and it's more about the relation that we have to our somatic experience. So to our anxiety in this case. So rather than managing it, rather than doing more, rather than creating new practices or routines, it's actually more important to be able to meet your anxiety, to relate to it in a different way, rather than trying to control it, fix it, stop it. It's, can I meet the anxiety with more attunement, more awareness, more curiosity, compassion, right? All of these regulated parts of us. Can we meet the anxiety parts with a bit more attunement? And that's what's going to make the biggest difference. So I definitely picked this next question because I feel like I experienced the opposite of this. The question is, what are your thoughts on commitment issues such as fear of commitment? I did not have fear of commitment. I had this desire for commitment, but that'll be a conversation for a different episode. So I first just want to say that when we have a fear of commitment, it's less about the other person and it's more about this implicit, this body memory of what commitment maybe once cost you. Okay, so somatically, there is this fear, this protector that's saying, I need to feel safe, I need to feel free, or whatever that might be, before I can choose to stay. And oftentimes, when we are choosing to stay in a relationship or we are choosing to commit to something, we can't safeguard ourselves from the potential of hurt. And so in order to avoid the hurt or to avoid what that commitment once cost us, we just choose to not commit at all. So what I would encourage you to do is to explore commitments in degrees and not absolutes. So for instance, what feels safe to commit to today? That feels much more tolerable. That feels much more titrated. That feels like a much simpler, maybe easier step for you rather than committing to something huge. And you can do this by asking the question, what feels safe to commit to today? And that might be, I feel safe enough to commit to my friend that texts me and asks if I wanted to go to lunch on Friday, right? So can I reach out and can I commit to that right now? And as I commit to that, even though I'm stretching myself a little bit, what do I notice? How can I feel a little bit of the activation within my body and within my nervous system? And it's not anything big. It should be tolerable. But as we take just a little bit of time to be with that, we are expanding our capacity to be with the uncertainty that commitment can bring. And I just want to say this, that true commitment does not come from pressure, but it comes from a regulated nervous system that feels safe enough to choose and to choose something different. Let's move into our next question. So, can somatics help rewire the limbic system from things like mold where it's hypersensitive? Yes, absolutely. And this is such a big component of the work that we do in the somatic healing world. So just a quick little neurobiology lesson here. The limbic system is important because it houses this little structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is known as the threat detector or the threat center of the brain. Think of it like the fire alarm. Okay. And when the body starts to sense through neuroception, okay, through our senses, that something feels not right, okay, is what we call a trigger. And so the amygdala turns on the alarm. And this is what initiates our survival responses of the nervous system. This is what then initiates the floodgates opening of our survival hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. All of these body systems start to change. We have these body-wide responses when the amygdala becomes active. Now, why is this important? So when the amygdala, right, our threat detector, has been overwhelmed either by trauma, by chronic stress, or by environmental factors or conditions like mold, for instance, then it can get stuck on high alert. And so it starts to fire off these danger signals even when you're actually safe or there is no danger. And so somatic work helps the body to feel safe again, not just think it, okay? Because again, the amygdala takes in information through our sensory motor system, not through our cognitive brain. It's like, I know the mold is not here. I've done all of the tests. There's no mold in my environment, but why is my body still responding in this way? Well, that's because the body and the nervous system hasn't caught up to what the brain already knows, which is that we are safe. So somatic healing and somatic work helps the body to feel safe again, not just think it. And we experience that in the nervous system. So we do this in a number of ways. Number one, by tracking sensation and staying with small doses of discomfort, small, so that the system learns this isn't dangerous anymore, right? And we also bring in resourcing, which I've talked about a little bit. And these are the micro moments of pleasure, of safety and regulation. And we use those practices like orienting or gentle touch to help soothe the body from the bottom up, not from the brain down. And over time, it's these repeated somatic experiences that literally start to rewire the threat pathways. And so the limbic system isn't just running the show anymore, the body is, because the nervous system has started to catch up to the safety of the present and is no longer living in the survival of the past. All right, just a few more questions to go. This next one, I'm a life coach and I'd like to get certified in somatic healing. Do you offer that, or can you recommend something? So I would definitely say that we have an episode that is coming out very soon. And it is all about becoming a somatic practitioner. And it is a deep, deep dive, you guys, on everything that you need to know to become a somatic practitioner, to become a somatic experiencing practitioner, differentiating between the two, what the certification is going to look like, the different training programs, the realistic investment and expectations, the benefits, the downsides, all of the things. So I give you a really clear roadmap. Keep an eye out for that episode. Okay, we have another relationship question here. How do we move from protectiveness towards openness in relationships? So I first just want to give you a quick rundown on how the nervous system prioritizes connection. So when we are in a state of our ventral vagal in the nervous system, which is kind of like your rest and digest state, this is the state of safety and connection. So in this state, the nervous system prioritizes connection. Now, when we come down the nervous system ladder into the middle, the state of sympathetic, which is our fight or flight state, here, the nervous system is going to prioritize protection. When we come down to the bottom of the nervous system ladder, which is our state of dorsal, kind of our shutdown state, here the nervous system is going to prioritize disconnection from the world, from others, and from self. So when we're talking about moving from protection towards openness in relationships, what we're really seeking is not forcing openness, but creating enough safety for it to emerge naturally. And we can do this by starting small. There's a difference between knowing that you're safe in a relationship and feeling safe. And so this can happen through eye contact, shared silence, regulated presence, being witnessed to, or having affirming conversations. Another thing that you can do is that you can start to go deeper in the current relationships where you do feel open. So start to track, how do I know that I feel open and safe in this relationship? Start to notice how that feels somatically in the body. Well, maybe I'm leaning in. Maybe my chest feels more open. Maybe my eyes feel safer to connect, and there's these bids of connection. Maybe I feel safe enough hugging this person, right? Notice how that safety feels in the body. Now, what you also want to do is you want to start to track that impulse to pull away. And when you start to track it, whether it's like this micro movement, maybe it's a shift, right, where you are starting to lean away, or maybe it's a crossing of your arms, maybe it's a looking down or looking off and not making eye contact. My encouragement to you would be to gently stay just a second longer when it feels tolerable enough to do so. So rather than looking away impulsively, can we just hold that gaze for a second or two longer until it starts to feel like too much? And what you're doing is you are just getting in some reps. You are building out that resilience and the capacity and the ability to be with something that once didn't feel safe, but that we can now start to rewire back to safety. And then lastly, I'll just leave you with this. Openness isn't the absence of fear. Think of it rather as the willingness to stay connected with it, right? So there might be times where you want to be open with someone, but you're afraid to do so, but you do it instead, right? And anytime fear is present, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be open, but it's the willingness to be with it in a way that feels tolerable or safe enough to do so. All right, guys, last question. What are your plans with the Montana property? Oh man, I feel like I've been sharing about this a lot on social media lately just because it's been so deep on my heart, just this period of life that we're moving into where we're trying to slow down, we're trying to create a new lifestyle and a rhythm that's centered around reconnecting to ourselves, to our true nature, and connecting to nature itself, and just unplugging from the world. I think we live in a world that's so noisy and so busy. And I know that these early years for my kiddos, it's important that they know that this is not normal. And this is not how we really should be living our lives constantly. And so we do that in small ways in our household, but also in this really big way. We bought property in Montana at the beginning of this year, and we are hoping to start building a second home there soon. And this is also going to be kind of a home base for Body First Healing events. It's going to be a home base for retreats, practitioner trainings, and events. And it's also going to be just an investment property for us too. But more than anything, I feel like it is a bold decision that we are making as a family to no longer participate in the rat race of life 24/7. It's a place where we can go and reset and reconnect to each other, to ourselves, and to nature. And we're really looking forward to that. And I am looking forward to sharing that beautiful slice of heaven and earth with you all very soon. All right, my friends, that wraps up our episode this week on the Body First Healing podcast. If you found this message to be supportive, enlightening, I don't know if it brought any support to you in any way, please reach out to me on Instagram at healwithbritt, 2 T's, and just let me know. Let me know what resonated, what you're reflecting on, what message you really took away from this. If you have a question for a future episode, please reach out to me there as well. Remember that you can learn more about the Body First Healing book, the Body First Healing program, and all of our incredible offerings at bodyfirsthealing.com. Can't wait to see you next week on the podcast. Have a great one. Thank you so much for tuning into the Body First Healing podcast. If this episode resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you subscribed, left a review, or shared it with someone that you love. I'll see you back here next week, and until then, be gentle with yourself. You're doing the best you can with what you have, and that is more than enough. Just a quick note, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a qualified provider for personal support.